I never thought this day would come, but here we are, John thought, as he stood at the threshold of the courtroom, the weight of his marriage crumbling around him. His palms were sweaty, his heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't back down. The doors swung open, and there she was, Rachel, sitting there with David, her lover. They were laughing like it was some kind of joke. The life they had built together, the vows they had made, meant nothing now. John stepped forward, and the room fell into silence. All eyes were on him as Rachel's gaze shifted toward him. There was no guilt in her eyes, no remorse, just a cold, calculated smile. "John, it's over," she said casually, as if it were a decision made over dinner, not a lifetime. David gave him a smug look, and John could almost hear him gloating in his mind. It wasn't enough for them to destroy his life. They had to mock him in front of everyone. John took a deep breath, the anger simmering beneath the surface. He wasn't going to let them see him break. "Not today." "I know," he replied, his voice steady, betraying no emotion. But inside, his mind was racing. He could feel the knot in his stomach tightening. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. They had a family. They had dreams. And now, she was sitting there, flaunting her betrayal like it was nothing. But John had a plan. He wasn't the man he used to be. He wasn't going to take this lying down. The truth was coming, whether they liked it or not. He reached into his coat pocket and felt the weight of the envelope. The evidence. It was time for them to see who John Miller really was. The courtroom buzzed as the judge called for order. But John was already lost in his thoughts, the plan forming in his mind. He had all the proof he needed. He was going to make them pay. This wasn't going to end the way Rachel and David thought. The game was just beginning. The judge called for silence again, but John didn't care. He was done. He was done being the fool. He was done being the victim. The truth was coming out, and no amount of laughter from Rachel or smug looks from David was going to stop him. He stood there, his posture straight, his eyes locked on Rachel. This was it. "I'm done with this charade," he said calmly, his voice carrying across the courtroom. "You're not walking away from this, Rachel. Not yet. The truth is about to come out." Rachel's smile faltered for a brief second, but she quickly recovered, her expression hardening. She wasn't used to being challenged, but John wasn't going to let her get away with this. "You're right. It is over," she said, her voice no longer filled with smugness, but with a hint of uncertainty. John took another step forward, his hand gripping the envelope tighter. "No, Rachel. It's not over. Not by a long shot." He turned to the judge, his mind clear, his resolve solid. The courtroom went dead silent as John pulled out the envelope and laid it on the table, the weight of what was about to happen hanging in the air. Rachel and David exchanged a quick, nervous glance. They had no idea what was coming. This was only the beginning. John stood in the courtroom, the heavy silence pressing down on him. His eyes were fixed on Rachel and David, who still hadn't fully grasped the gravity of what was about to happen. He could feel the weight of the envelope in his hand, the evidence that would change everything. The judge had been waiting for him to speak, and he knew this moment couldn't be wasted. He took a deep breath, the adrenaline pushing his heartbeat faster. "Your Honor," John began, his voice calm but firm. "This is the truth you've been waiting for." He laid the envelope on the table in front of him. Rachel's eyes flickered to it, and for the first time, John saw a flash of uncertainty in her gaze. David, too, stiffened, his confident smirk faltering just for a moment. John turned to face them, his posture rigid, the years of betrayal finally catching up to him. "I've spent years building this life, this family, believing in a love that now feels like a lie," he continued. His voice was steady, but inside, the anger was like fire. The judge nodded, signaling him to proceed. John slid the papers out of the envelope, placing them carefully in front of the judge. "These are the documents that prove everything. The DNA results, the emails, the financial transactions, the truth that Rachel thought she could hide from me," he said, his eyes never leaving Rachel's face. Rachel's jaw tightened, her eyes flickering with panic, but she quickly regained her composure. "This is absurd," she said, her voice sharp and defensive. "What are you trying to prove, John?" But her words were hollow. John could hear the tremble beneath her controlled exterior. He wasn't going to let her talk her way out of this. "You thought you could walk away with everything," John said, his gaze unflinching. "You thought you could leave me in the dark while you built a new life with him." He gestured to David. "But you made one mistake, Rachel. You underestimated me. The judge flipped through the documents, his face unreadable, and then glanced up at Rachel. "I'll have to review all of this before making a decision," the judge said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. John felt a surge of satisfaction at the judge's words. Rachel and David might have thought they were in control, but the tables were turning. As the judge called for a brief recess, John stood still, not moving a muscle. Rachel stood up, her face pale, and walked toward him. "This isn't over, John," she said, her voice low and full of venom. "You'll regret this." John didn't flinch. "I already regret one thing," he replied quietly, looking straight into her eyes. "Trusting you." With that, Rachel turned and walked out of the courtroom, David following closely behind. But John knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life. The truth had finally come to light, and there was no going back. As he left the courtroom, John felt a sense of calm wash over him. The battle wasn't won yet, but for the first time in years, he had control of his own fate. John walked out of the courthouse with his head held high, the cool breeze hitting his face like a breath of fresh air. For the first time in years, he felt like himself again. The weight of the past was still there, but the shackles had been broken. He had taken the first step toward reclaiming his life. Rachel and David had thought they could walk away unscathed, but John had made sure the truth would come out. He wasn't going to let them have the last laugh. He had been quiet for too long, suffering in silence as they destroyed everything he had built. Now, it was his turn to speak. As he sat in his car, the engine humming softly, he replayed the events in his mind. He could still see Rachel's face when she realized what was happening. The look of panic, the way she tried to regain control but failed. It was satisfying, but John knew it wasn't enough. This wasn't just about exposing Rachel's betrayal. It was about taking back what was rightfully his. He had to make sure he kept fighting, not just for his own peace of mind, but for the future he deserved. He had a plan. John had already contacted his lawyer, and things were moving fast. The next step would be making sure the divorce proceedings were in his favor. The house, the assets, the kids. He was taking back everything he had lost. But even more than that, he wanted to make sure Rachel understood the consequences of her actions. He wasn't just going to let her walk away without facing the full weight of what she had done. The betrayal was personal, but it was also a matter of principle. He had been faithful, devoted, and honest. All she had given him in return was lies. He wasn't going to let that slide. John pulled into his driveway and took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. His house, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt empty. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew it couldn't be worse than the life he had been living before. As he walked through the door, the silence hit him harder than ever. His kids weren't home, and Rachel's things were still scattered around. But the space felt different now. It was his space, not hers. He had been living in her shadow for too long, but that was over. John made a decision then and there. He was going to rebuild his life, piece by piece. The anger that had been bubbling inside him was still there, but now it had purpose. He wasn't going to be the victim anymore. He was going to be the one in control. As he sat down on the couch, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his lawyer. The divorce papers were ready to be signed. John looked at the message, a small smile creeping onto his face. It was happening. He was taking the next step. This was his moment to rise from the ashes and show Rachel that he was stronger than she ever thought. And this time, there was no turning back. John had spent the night thinking about everything that had happened. The anger was still there, but it had shifted into something else, something calmer, more calculated. He wasn't going to rush things anymore. He had already done the hard part. The papers were signed, the divorce was moving forward, but there was still work to be done. As John sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, he reflected on how much his life had changed in such a short time. He wasn't sure what his future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Rachel have the last word. She had thought she could walk away from him, from everything they had built together, but John was smarter than that. He had seen through her lies long before the court battle. She had underestimated him, thinking that he would just roll over and let her take everything. But John wasn't the same man he was when they first met. He had been broken once, but not anymore. He had rebuilt himself. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from his lawyer. The settlement offer had come through. John glanced at the screen, his fingers tightening around the phone. The offer was tempting, but John knew that taking it would mean giving Rachel exactly what she wanted: complete control over everything they had worked for. He wasn't going to let that happen. The only way forward now was to fight. He wasn't just fighting for money or assets or anything material. He was fighting for his dignity, for his future, for his right to walk away from this mess with his head held high. Rachel had never taken him seriously, but John was about to show her just how wrong she was. He took a deep breath and typed a quick reply to his lawyer, telling him not to accept the offer and that he wanted to proceed with full custody. His children meant everything to him, and he wasn't going to let Rachel manipulate them as she had done to him. The next few weeks were a blur. John focused on his work and on building a life that didn't include Rachel. He spent more time with his kids, taking them to their soccer games, helping them with homework, and making sure they knew he was there for them, no matter what. It wasn't easy. Some days were harder than others, but John felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. The day of the court hearing finally arrived, and John walked into the courtroom with a quiet confidence. Rachel was already there, sitting with her lawyer, looking as cold and distant as ever. David wasn't with her this time, and John couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. As the proceedings began, John listened carefully to his lawyer's arguments, the points they made about custody and the settlement. But he didn't say much. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than words. When it was his turn to speak, John stood up, his voice calm and steady. "Your Honor," he began, "I've spent years being the husband and father that this family needed. But now it's time for me to be the man I need to be. I won't let her take everything from me. I won't let her take my kids." The room fell silent. Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but John held his ground. He knew he had done the right thing. This was his fight now, and he wasn't backing down. The judge leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the documents in front of him. The tension in the room was palpable. John stood tall, his heart steady, but his mind racing. Rachel was sitting across from him, her posture stiff, her eyes hard and unblinking. She hadn't spoken a word since John had made his statement. Her lawyer was fidgeting, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the case was going. John couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. For the first time in this entire process, he felt like he was in control. "Mr. Miller," the judge finally said, his voice breaking the silence. "It seems you have a solid case here. Custody will be determined after further review, but I'm inclined to agree with your lawyer's recommendation." John's lawyer, a calm and composed man named Robert, nodded. Rachel shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the papers in front of her. John could see the frustration building in her. She wasn't used to losing, especially not to him. For years, she had manipulated situations, always coming out on top. But not this time. Not anymore. As the hearing continued, John's thoughts wandered back to the past few weeks. He had spent so much time preparing, gathering evidence, and making sure everything was in place. The kids were his priority, and he wasn't going to let Rachel tear them apart. Rachel had always made it seem like she was the better parent, the better partner. But John knew the truth. She had always been more concerned with her career and social status than with the people who mattered most. His children, his family, they were the ones who had been there for him, who had been his support through all the challenges. Rachel had failed them. As the judge called for another recess, John stood up and walked to the back of the courtroom. He needed a moment to collect his thoughts. The case wasn't over yet, but it was close. The weight of everything that had happened over the past few months was beginning to hit him. The anger he had felt when he first discovered Rachel's betrayal was still there, but it had evolved. It was no longer about revenge. It was about taking back his life, his dignity, and most importantly, his children. He wasn't going to let her ruin their future. John walked to the window, staring out at the bright, blue sky. It felt like a new beginning. The world outside seemed so much larger than the courtroom, so much more full of possibilities. He had come a long way, but there was still a journey ahead. As he turned to head back to his seat, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from his lawyer. "We've got this. Stay strong." John smiled to himself. This was it. The moment of truth. He was going to win. He wasn't just going to win in court. He was going to win his life back. The next few weeks would be tough, but he knew he could handle it. He had already survived the hardest part, and now he was ready for the rest of the fight. The days after the hearing were a blur of emotions for John. He had won the first round, But he knew that this wasn't the end. The real battle was still ahead. He spent his days working hard, focused on providing for his kids, making sure they felt the stability he was fighting for. There were moments when the weight of it all felt overwhelming, but he refused to let it break him. He couldn't afford to falter now. Rachel had tried to make him doubt himself, tried to convince him that he didn't have a chance, but John had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to give up without a fight. A few weeks passed, and the second court date arrived. John felt a sense of calm he hadn't expected. The nerves that had once made his hands shake before hearings were gone. He had a plan, and he wasn't going to let anything distract him from it. As he walked into the courtroom that day, he felt the familiar rush of anticipation. Rachel was there, her expression as cold as ever, but there was something different about her today. The confidence she once had seemed to have faded. John could see the cracks starting to show. This wasn't the woman who had once dominated their marriage. This was someone who was starting to realize the weight of her actions. The judge called the session to order, and John sat back, watching as his lawyer presented the case. Rachel's lawyer was still trying to twist the facts in her favor, but John knew it wouldn't work this time. The evidence was clear, and there was no way to argue against it. As the session went on, John listened carefully. His lawyer made his points, showing the judge the financial records, the emails, and the evidence of Rachel's betrayal. It was all coming together. But even as the case was being laid out, John felt his thoughts drifting back to his children. They were his motivation. They were the reason he had pushed so hard. He couldn't let them down. He had to win this. The judge asked John to speak, and for a moment, he hesitated. He had said so much already, but this moment felt different. This time, it wasn't just about facts and figures. It was about his family, about what he had lost, and what he was fighting to get back. John stood up, his voice steady. "Your Honor," he began, "I've spent my life building a family. I gave everything to this woman, to this marriage. But now, I'm here fighting not just for what I've lost, but for my children's future. They deserve stability. They deserve the truth. I'm not just fighting for custody. I'm fighting for the right to be the father I know I can be." He paused, looking directly at Rachel, who had gone silent. "Rachel, you thought you could tear this family apart, but I'm not letting you take my kids. I won't let you take my life." The room was still. Even Rachel seemed to hesitate, her usual defensiveness giving way to something else, regret, maybe, or realization. John didn't know, but he wasn't about to back down now. He had fought for too long, and he wasn't going to stop until his kids were safe, until the life he had built was whole again. As the judge deliberated, John sat back down, his hands clasped together. The decision would come soon, but he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He had done everything he could. Now, all he had to do was wait. The days following the court session were filled with tension, but John could finally see a light at the end of the tunnel. His children were adjusting well, and he was starting to feel like himself again. The weight of the past months, the pain of betrayal, seemed a little less heavy. Still, every day felt like a battle. John continued to stay focused on the future, his children's future. The waiting had been agonizing, but now it was time to know where he stood. The phone call came a few days later, the voice on the other end calm but firm. "John, the judge has made his decision." His heart raced as he tried to steady his breath. "You're getting full custody." The words hit him like a wave, but he didn't allow himself to break. He had fought hard for this moment, and now it was his. The relief was almost overwhelming, but John knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter. As he hung up, he looked around his home, the place that had once felt like a battlefield but now seemed full of possibility. His kids were playing in the next room, their laughter filling the house with a sound he had missed so much. He was going to give them everything they deserved: stability, love, and a fresh start. He had been the man he needed to be for so long, and now it was time to rebuild. Rachel's words from the past echoed in his mind, but he didn't let them linger. She had tried to tear everything down, but now he was in control. He had taken back his life, and nothing, not even her, could change that. As he prepared to tell his kids the good news, John felt a calm sense of purpose. This was his moment to be the father he had always wanted to be. He wasn't going to let the past define him anymore. The battle had been hard, but it had made him stronger. And as he watched his children run toward him, their smiles lighting up the room, John realized that this was the life he had fought for. He had won. Not just the case, but his future, his family, and his peace of mind. It had been a long road, but in the end, it was worth every step. John woke up to a quiet morning, the sunlight streaming through the window, casting a warm glow on the house. It felt different now, like the weight had lifted. His kids were still asleep, and for the first time in a long time, John allowed himself a moment of peace. The past year had been a whirlwind of emotions, betrayal, pain, but also strength and clarity. He had fought through it all, and now he was finally on the other side. His kids had settled into their new routine, and the bond between them was growing stronger every day. He had become the father he always wanted to be, present and involved, always there for them, no matter what. Rachel had been quiet since the court ruling. John hadn't heard from her much, except for the occasional lawyer letter or text about logistics regarding the kids. She had stopped trying to manipulate the situation, realizing that John was not someone she could control anymore. John wasn't concerned with Rachel anymore. He was focused on what mattered: his kids, his future, and his peace. As he made breakfast for the kids, he found himself smiling for the first time in a while. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence now, a peaceful one. It was no longer a place of tension and anger. It had become a home again. After breakfast, John drove his kids to their soccer practice, their laughter filling the car. It was the simple moments like these that made it all worth it. He had won his life back, and nothing could take that from him. The judge had ruled in his favor, and now, John was making sure to hold on to everything he had fought for. As they arrived at the soccer field, John watched his kids run off to join their friends, their faces bright with excitement. He stood there for a moment, taking in the sight. His kids were happy, and that was all that mattered. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from his lawyer. "Rachel has signed the final papers. It's over." John read the message, and for a second, he just stood there, letting the words sink in. It was finally over. The battle had been long and painful, but it was done. And in the end, John had won. He had his children, his peace, and his future. Rachel couldn't take that from him anymore. He took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, and that was everything. As he watched his kids play, he realized that the future was bright. It wasn't just a victory in the courtroom, it was a new beginning. He had come through it all, stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever came next. The pain was behind him, and ahead lay a life full of possibilities. Months passed, and life slowly but surely returned to a rhythm that felt right. John had settled into his new normal, and his kids had too. The tension that once loomed over their home was gone, replaced by a peaceful calm that John had fought so hard to bring back. He'd built a new life for them, brick by brick, with patience, understanding, and love. Every morning, he woke up with a sense of gratitude, not just for the roof over their heads, but for the family he had fought to protect. He watched his kids grow stronger, more confident, as they navigated their own challenges, knowing they could rely on him. The memories of the past, the painful months in the courtroom, the lies, and the betrayal, started to feel distant. But every once in a while, they would resurface, and John would remember the man he had been, the man who had lost so much but never gave up. He remembered the court days, the moments of doubt, the anger that had consumed him, and the quiet strength he had found within himself. But now, those memories no longer controlled him. He had reclaimed his life. One Saturday afternoon, while sitting on the porch, John received an unexpected message. It was from Rachel. She had sent a simple text: "I'm sorry." John stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the phone. He hadn't heard from her in months, not since the finalization of the divorce. He had wondered if she would ever reach out, but he hadn't expected it to be like this. "I'm sorry," the words echoed in his mind. John didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure how to. Part of him wanted to ask why it had taken her so long to realize the damage she had caused. Part of him wanted to tell her everything he had been holding in, to tell her how her betrayal had torn him apart, how she had shattered their family, but another part of him just didn't want to go back there. He had moved on. The past was behind him, and it was time to focus on the future. He put the phone down and walked inside to find his kids. As they played in the living room, John smiled. He didn't need to hold on to the past any longer. He had his family, and that was enough. He had learned that there was more to life than holding on to pain, more to life than dwelling on things he couldn't change. He had fought for them, for his future, and now he was living it. He was done with regret. He was done with the ghosts of the past. As he watched his kids, he realized that this was what mattered most, seeing them happy, seeing them thrive. His focus had shifted, and for the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. The divorce had marked the end of one chapter, but it had also opened the door to a new beginning. A beginning filled with love, purpose, and a family that would always have his back. And as he sat there, watching his kids grow, John knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be.